Thank you all for joining us today as we launch our Finance for Nature series about conservation and why we should consider nature more than a free good. I'm Deborah Lair, Vice Chairman and Executive Director of the Paulson Institute. We're delighted to be joined by our partners at Finance for Biodiversity, the Nature Conservancy, the Institute for International Finance, and the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsh Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. To set the stage for us and provide his insights on this very important and essential topic, I'm delighted to introduce our chairman, Hank Paulson.
So, Deborah, thank you. Thank you all for joining us for this event. Thank you to our partners. Now, this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and I really look forward to listening to today's panel. But I'll begin with a few framing remarks. My first point is that the COVID-15 or COVID-19 pandemic has shown a very bright light on what is a huge collective failure for the global community to respond to what should have been a very predictable crisis. But we didn't. It should have been a wake-up call, but we are right now in danger of sleepwalking toward what should be a very, very predictable crisis. What we've seen, though, is that UN initiatives like the one currently underway, voluntary initiatives aimed at dealing with this biodiversity loss, have rather than making a difference, they've made no progress. They've identified the problem, but the problem has accelerated. We are seeing the loss of species, extinctions at 1,000 times the historical rate. If we continue on this pace, we're going to lose half the species on the planet by the middle of this century. And you've got to ask yourself why. Why have these voluntary UN initiatives been so inadequate? What's going on here? I think the reason is pretty clear, and that is that our economic systems, our political systems, our financial markets do not put a value on the services that nature provides. It's hard to put a value on some of the natural services, no doubt about it. But the fact that we don't put a value on it means that they're essentially treated as a free good, and policymakers very often treat them as if as if the value is zero. And so, what does this mean? This means that actions that conserve biodiversity, are not rewarded. Actions that destroy or damage biodiversity are not penalized. So it's pretty clear that we need some kind of framework to really mobilize the global community to make a real difference before it's too late. And so we need to, I would say in this order, value, protect, and restore biodiversity or restore natural capital. And I emphasize those in that order, because if we don't value something, we're not going to protect it. And protecting it is much more important even than restoring it, because it's much cheaper to protect it in the first place than it is to have to restore it. But there's obviously great opportunities to restore nature. Now, the Paulson Institute, working with the Nature Conservancy and some other organizations, last year came up with a report that I think makes a very real difference. It's called Valuing Nature, and we've shown a light on the biodiversity funding gap here in this Financing Nature report. And what I liked about the report was we not only made a compelling case for putting an economic value on nature, but we went into a lot of detail in terms of the financing flows, the funding flows globally for biodiversity. And I think pretty much identified every policy and every financing mechanism and looked at them very pragmatically, analyzed them, what's worked, how effective have they been? And I recommend that you all read that report. But let me just very quickly now emphasize the three findings of the report. And I think they're pretty clear and they're pretty obvious. And the first one is that it's an essential role of government to give us a policy framework for protecting nature. And here I'm talking about not just policies, but regulations, subsidies, tax breaks, so that's the essential role of government. And, we put a value on the funding gap, but what stood out to me was that it would make a huge difference and it wouldn't require much new funding if governments did two things. One is taking a look at these dysfunctional subsidies. Now, we have dysfunctional subsidies in a number of areas, but the biggest area was ag. And the subsidies that incentivize production of ag products were just very, very harmful. And by restructuring, reordering those subsidies, there's a big, big opportunity. And to still have the ag production we need, and it makes a big difference. The second thing is, if the financial sector were required, or voluntarily, but I think required to disclose how their borrowing, their lending activities or investment activities either impaired natural capital or conserved natural capital, that would make a big difference. So those are the two things that stood out to me. And without government acting, there's really not much that the private sector can do. They can do some things, but it'll be limited. But when you look at the private sector, you need to say the governments aren't going to have the funding they required. So with the right policy framework, there's a lot that the private sector can do. Now, I always emphasize to people, though, that the private sector capital isn't going to come in the size required to invest and get a loss. Investing in a loss or lending for there to be a loss is not a sustainable business model. But there are some real opportunities to do things. And, our report made a big deal out of securitizing asset classes. I think there's a lot of room for creativity by the private sector looking at either productive soils or pollinators or watersheds. And I always like to use a watershed as an example because, New York City is just a real example. About 20 years ago when they were looking at building a new water filtration plant, it would have cost $7.5 or $8 billion. And instead they invested $1.5 billion in preserving the Catskills, the watershed there, and it made a big difference. I've done work with the Nature Conservancy, the Latin American Conservation Council of the Nature Conservancy in Latin America, where again, mayors and governors, and usually mayors love to invest in gray infrastructure, right? In water treatment plants and pipelines and aqueducts and so on. But you get a bigger payback if you invest in green infrastructure and preserving watersheds. And so again, a real opportunity for the private sector to innovate. And I think there's a lot that can be done. The third point that came out of our study really placed an emphasis on urgency and, looking at where we are with the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's no doubt that this is just devastating parts of the world where we have the most biodiversity. If you look at what's happening in Latin America, for instance, a region which I follow very carefully, the health, what's going on in terms of the loss of life, the health crisis is devastating, and economics is also, they're way down. It's going to take a lot of stimulus to help pull them out. And during a crisis, you find that there's a real emphasis on what is urgent as opposed to what is important. And our political system already is geared toward, toward short-term gains as opposed to long-term prosperity. But so we're at a situation where it's very, very important that, we all talk about the importance of environmental ministers. Environmental ministers are important, and heads of state are important, but finance ministers more than ever need to understand the case for a green recovery. And there's a really strong case for a green recovery right now in terms of how investments in a green recovery pay off in terms of jobs, and it'll make a big difference in terms of attracting capital. So a big emphasis on the importance of getting finance ministers to buy in. So let me wrap up my framework by saying, this fall, we're going to see the CBD COP15 in Kunming, China. And I'm just assuming that will be declared a success, and it'll be important because governments will come together, they'll set targets, they'll set initiatives. And you know what? It'll be totally and completely meaningless unless there's action below that, unless you see the political will at the government level, the private sector level. I think we've got the tools to do this right now. We've got the tools. And I'll tell you, I had a long career in finance. I spent time in government. I've spent time with NGOs. I've spent a lot of time talking with CEOs around the world about conservation, biodiversity, preserving nature, and so on. And I've never seen more interest around this issue than I see today. So I see a real opportunity. And I see some of the things I see coming out of finance and big financial institutions and small financial institutions and fintech is all very exciting. So I see a real opportunity. I think this is, people overuse the word tipping point. I think there's a tipping point. There's a compelling economic case for preserving nature, but I don't want to end with the economic case, because I would just simply say this. When I look at the natural world, and I think there's an increased appreciation for people during the pandemic of the natural world, I look at the inspiration one can get from nature, the beauty, all the intellectual curiosity that this inspires in us. I think much of what is good about life is embodied in nature. So I think there's a real reason for protecting nature just for its own sake, but there is, this compelling economic interest. So Deborah, over to you and to your panel. And thank you.
Great. Thanks, Hank. I think that really was a very inspiring presentation and really helps frame the discussion that we're going to have today. We are so fortunate to have 4 people who really have been drivers behind this new thinking around how to start financing nature. So let me start by introducing them before we get into the details. Simon Zadek. Simon is the chair of finance for biodiversity. He was head of the Secretariat for the UN Secretary General's Task Force on Digital Financing of the Sustainable Development Goals and senior advisor on finance in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. And he was co-director of UNEP's inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system. In these roles, he co-chaired China's Green Finance Task Force or the G20's Green Finance Task Force, and led the Green Finance Study Group Secretariat under the Chinese, German, and Argentinian G20 presidencies. He's been a very good friend of the Paulson Institutes and one of the most innovative thinkers around green finance today. Andrew Deutsch. Andrew is the Director of Global Policy, Institutions, and Conservation Finance at the Nature Conservancy. He directs the organization's global policy work spanning the areas of biodiversity, sustainable development, and conservation finance, as well as overseeing relationships with international organizations, multilateral development banks, and foreign aid agencies. Andrew was instrumental behind the study that we did, the Paulson Institute, with TNC and Financing Nature, and really has been a big believer and advocate for finding ways to consider how we put a price on nature. Kathy Bowman Macleod. Kathy is the Senior Vice President and Director of the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council. She's really a pioneer in the field of climate resilience and adaptation. She brings an expertise in science, strategy, policy, and finance with proven leadership skills in developing groundbreaking climate resilient solutions, some of which we're going to hear about today with the innovative work that's being done at the Adrienne Arsht Center at the Atlantic Council. And Sonia Gibbs. Sonia and her colleagues at the Institute of International Finance, where she's the managing director and head of sustainable finance for the global policy initiatives, have been early supporters of the whole green finance revolution. Through her leadership, they have really driven a lot of the change and regulatory discussion that we see happening today that is now showing up in the G20 and the G7 and others. She co-leads IIF's policy work on sustainable finance and infrastructure investment. So a warm welcome to all of you. I think Hank really laid a very good foundation and an overview for what we're going to talk about today. More and more we're hearing not just discussion about green finance, but also looking at the importance of putting a value on nature as we hear more about climate change and the impact of weather, whether it's heat or it's hurricanes, the impact that it has on emerging markets, and the importance of, when we're looking at valuations, how we look at creating asset classes, for example, out of, as Hank was saying, bees, bats, trees, and coastlines. So, Simon, I'm going to put you on the spot first and turn to you. Help level set for us and provide us with an overview of what's happening in nature financing. Why is this something that we should consider worth financing, and why has it become such an issue recently and being discussed and taken up in places like the G7, where you wouldn't usually think financing nature would be an issue?
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks to Hank and all of our partners and colleagues for inviting us onto this panel. So I'm not going to restate the value proposition in broad terms. I think Hank has done that really well. Maybe sort of one tweak to the broader narrative, and then I wanted to jump into some really quite practical examples. And I think the tweak that we draw inspiration from through the climate work that we've all been involved in is that when we began talking about climate finance some years ago, we really did frame it as a mobilization challenge. You know, how do we raise climate finance? And I think what we have discovered as the days and months and years have gone on is that, yes, mobilization of finance for certain investments are important, but really the challenge is one of alignment. Yeah, that we have $350 trillion worth of assets across financial and capital markets. We have $40 trillion worth of consumer spending every year. You know, we have 25% of the global economy, you know, driven effectively by various aspects of public finance. You know, even looking at the central banking side, you know, following the pandemic's quantitative easing sort of second round, you know, that amounts to another $40 trillion worth of assets sitting on central bank balance sheets around the world. Our challenge is not to figure out how to get more money, but how to channel that money in a way that is positively aligned to nature outcomes. And I think that kind of creates or establishes, if you like, some system design challenges, as Mark Carney has made the point a number of times in relation to climate. as we begin to look at nature. So that's the only sort of tweak or addition that I would make to Hank's broad framing. And then I wanted to sort of jump in, if you like, to a couple of practical examples. So we've got to measure risk. You know, what can I say? Who in the financial sector would see that as the wrong thing? But we have a lot of challenges in the data space. We have a lot of challenges given that there isn't a carbon ton equivalent. And we have a lot of challenges in understanding how data relates to how nature relates to material financial risk in multiple domains, given the complexity and diversity of nature and also the way it feeds through into financial risk. But I think on the positive side, we're beginning to make progress. And I think Hank is absolutely right that now is the time where progress can be made very quickly. So for the last 8 months, a group of 70 financial institutions have been building out the first round of work on what will be the task force on nature-related financial disclosure, something that I'm involved in through my co-chairing of their technical expert group. You know, model broadly along the same lines as the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. TNFD, of course, is going to deal with the nature piece. But actually, of course, we all know that climate and nature are not on two different planets, and that what we really need to understand is what aspects of climate-related risk and management that many financial institutions are already driving forward actually cover many aspects of nature and what aspects don't. You know, so what are the connections between nature and climate as we begin to think about the way in which we would price risk? The TNFD will kind of launch proper over the next 6 weeks or 8 weeks or so. Yeah, and then we'll run for the next certainly 2 or 3 years alongside and working together with our friends in the climate community, trying to figure out the right metrics, figuring out where the data is going to come from. You know, many big data providers involved, such as Refinitiv and Bloomberg, as well as many specialized actors. And just down the road, we have the same thing going on in the central banking space. Some of you will know the network of central banks for greening the financial system really kind of picked up on the green finance agenda, trying to figure out where it fits into central bank mandates and activities. But in reality, since it was created, it's really focused on climate. And actually, I would even say an enormously important, but a narrow aspect of climate, which is the emissions agenda itself. And so now, for the first time, NGFS is progressing the first piece of work looking at what it would mean for central banks to begin to look at nature. The Dutch central bank has already kind of taken a lead in the same way that the Bank of England did on climate in putting out their first financial stability test related to nature-related risks. And now, hopefully, this large network of 60 central banks, NGFS, will begin to look at the nature aspects as well. And then I just wanted to add a couple more sort of examples, if you like, rather than grand propositions, and then pass back to you, Deborah, if I may. One is that, of course, measurement helps, but it doesn't help if it turns out it's not material. Yeah, or at least not material, you know, in a world where materiality is significantly driven, let's be honest, by auditors and lawyers, not even necessarily by business leaders. And so we have to take a broader view of risk, which goes beyond that narrowly defined view of materiality in a number of different respects. So whereas TCFD, if you like, bought into that narrow view of materiality, but then built out this big work on scenarios in order to extend risk assessment and perspectives beyond that narrow view. Similarly, TNFD will do the same thing. Rather than defining nature-related risks as only what we might think of as material today, it is extending its risk lens to include nature dependency and nature impacts, not simply as a good deed to the planet, although that has value in and of itself, but trying to go beyond into the longer term in backcasting what some of those risks might be for financial institutions and corporates. And then the last example I wanted really to give is in the liability space. So all of the things we've talked about so far are really in the credit space, but there's a great deal of work now going on looking at how extended liability might be relevant in the way in which financial institutions think about how they may need to take nature more rapidly and increasingly into account. The UK is in the process, as is the EU, of advancing a new set of due diligence obligations that will be both for corporates and for financial institutions, specifically in relation to deforestation. And that will not be a materiality test, but will be an impact test, and will be, if you like, subject to both reputational liability as well as potentially broader aspects of liability. Just to complete, I wanted to sort of re-emphasize in a way the point that Hank and Deborah, you made at the beginning. Many of the things that I've described to you are of course through a risk lens. And there is an upside story to this, needless to say, not only in the way we construct new financial assets, to your point, Deborah, but in thinking about where those big plays might be in the real economy. And I just wanted to sort of leave a thought, if you like. In the climate space, the breakthrough is really clean energy and clean vehicles. And of course, there are many, many other ways in which we are making positive, low carbon, climate resilient investments, but it's really those two spaces that have driven the agenda forward from a profit-making point of view, if you like, often supported by the appropriate policy frameworks. What is the equivalent in the nature space? Well, obviously, if it doesn't sit in food, it's unlikely to sit anywhere at all. And I think we're beginning to see the emergence, for example, of alternate protein and of vertical farming, just to illustrate, out from the margin, just as most of us thought about renewables energy, 10, 15 years ago, beginning to seep into what is effectively an $8 trillion part of the global economy, the food system itself. And I think we need to be open and positive in looking at how some of these early stage breakthroughs may turn out to be the clean energy and clean transport of the nature opportunity space. So back to you, Deborah. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Simon. And I think that really sets the stage, particularly the comments about innovation in the food system, to turn to Andrew to talk about nature-based solutions. I know many experts believe that we actually are on the verge of a climate boom, similar to the kind of tech boom that we saw in the 1990s, that we're going to be looking at all kinds of innovative solutions for helping the world move to a lower carbon economy. And Andrew, let's talk about nature-based solutions as part of that transition. What are your thoughts about their effectiveness? What are the types of solutions that we should be looking at, whether they're biodiversity offsets or looking at natural infrastructure, as we've seen in the kind of green finance world, as Simon was saying, there's so much focus on renewables. What are these ideas that are coming out in the nature context, and what are the roles that international institutions and these global dialogues that we're seeing, like the G7, play in really elevating the thinking and creating the framework around these discussions?
Thanks, Deborah. And first, thanks for helping to organize this session today. This is a really fruitful conversation. The first point I would want to make about nature-based solutions is that nature works. So think about the things that we can do in the climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and sort of natural infrastructure space. Some colleagues of mine at the Nature Conservancy did an analysis a few years ago that showed that nature-based solutions can provide up to 30% of the near-term cost-effective climate mitigation solutions. It's simple stuff like not cutting down tropical forests, forest restoration, and shifting to regenerative agriculture. But those are cost-effective things that are going to keep us on the pathway to 1.5 degrees. And then there are lots of opportunities in the adaptation space. If you think about investments in coastal ecosystems for protection, in floodplain restoration to deal with flood control. Kathy's an expert on this. She actually innovated some of this work when she was at the Nature Conservancy and looking at some of the insurance and financing models for coastal reef protection to protect a $10 billion tourism infrastructure in Cancun, for example. And then, as Hank pointed out, there's a whole range of things that nature can do to provide what we think of as traditional infrastructure services. He pointed to the iconic New York City watershed example of investing in upper watershed conservation and changing agricultural practices was far cheaper to provide water quality improvements, which is something every city needs. And we've seen that model replicated now in dozens of places around the world. So the point is, nature works. In the case of mitigation, we looked at the potential financial opportunities here in the Financing Nature report. And on the mitigation side, we think there's the space to grow from about $1 billion a year invested in nature-based mitigation to grow to something like $25 to $40 billion a year by the end of the decade. And then similarly on the adaptation and green infrastructure space, there's about $25 billion a year now going into that, much of it in the US, but I think that can be increased 4 or 5 times by the end of the decade. Probably the single most important policy innovation there is in the case of the US Army Corps of Engineers, who's the largest water infrastructure builder in the world. They now have a requirement that for every infrastructure project they do, they have to consider natural infrastructure alternatives or hybrid solutions. Doesn't mean they have to do it, but they have to consider it. And oftentimes it is the cost-effective solution. The second big point I want to make about nature-based solutions is that going green is good for growth. There's now a straight up economic case about why we should be investing in nature and nature-based solutions. In the case of now, as we're looking at pandemic recovery processes, there have been lots of studies that have gone back and looked at what were the job creation responses of investments in different sectors from stimulus after the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, 2010. And there's a lot of good data that shows that the best thing you could do for job creation is investing in natural resource management, good forest practices, ecosystem restoration, and conservation, because those tend to be highly labor-intensive activities. And in fact, the job creation per dollar spent in those fields is 3 to 4 times what the job creation per dollar spent is in traditional oil and gas, right? So if you want to increase the employment in the post-recovery or post-pandemic recovery stage, investing in nature is the way to go from an economic perspective. There's also a new study that's come out from the research department at the IMF that shows that going green actually has a higher economic multiplier effect for your GDP over several years. And that's true both in the renewable energy space relative to brown or fossil energy, and it's true in the climate smart or regenerative agriculture space relative to traditional agriculture. So again, going green is good for growth. In terms of what the international institutions can do, it really comes back to, say, Simon's point around not just finding projects to invest in nature, but really about mainstreaming nature and nature-based activities and nature impacts into financial thinking and financial decisions. Interestingly, most of the international institutions, if you think about the World Bank or what have you, they already have a biodiversity requirement on the books. And it's also been adopted by all of the equator banks, which is basically that they have to adopt or apply the mitigation hierarchy, meaning if you're doing an infrastructure project or an extractive industries project, there are certain places you need to avoid because of their biodiversity impact that is irreplaceable. When you do the project, you need to minimize the impacts. And for whatever residual impacts are left, you need to offset them, right? Provide some kind of environmental compensation for the impact that you have. Unfortunately, we don't really know how well that's working because there's very little transparency about the impact that has of the banks and the impacts of the behavior of their clients. So sort of the most near-term ask of both the public and private banks would be audit your compliance with IFC Performance Standard 6 or your requirements under the Equator Principles. I will note, though, that in the Financing Nature report, we calculated that when you look at the anticipated infrastructure build-out in the world over the next decade, we can go from something like $6 or $9 billion a year being generated with biodiversity offsets to somewhere around 160 to 170 billion. If we universally apply that principle, which the Biodiversity Convention is saying that's the way to manage the world's infrastructure. As a bit of a side note, we're very excited that the Biden administration has adopted a 50% emissions reduction goal by 2030. We need to have that investment in renewable energy if we're going to achieve that target. But some of my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy have done an analysis that shows that the #1 threat to intact ecosystems in the United States is the infrastructure build out that we're going to need to do to achieve zero carbon or decarbonization of the renewable energy sector or the electricity sector, right? It's all those transmission lines as we build new wind plants or wind facilities and solar facilities. We need to build new transmission infrastructure to get it from where the renewable energy sources are to where the population centers are. The way to do that in a smart way is apply the mitigation hierarchy. Certain places you need to avoid, minimize the impact, and offset it for environmental compensation when there are impacts. And we've pretty much figured out there are ways to do that with low to no impact to biodiversity across the US and across the world. The last point I want to make in terms of what can the international institutions do, but really what we need to do in the finance community overall is sort of shift the narrative. Watching the World Bank IMF spring meetings this year, I was really encouraged that green recovery is very much on the table. And whether we're talking about debt restructuring and debt sustainability for developing countries that are taking on increased debt loads, or we're talking about economic stimulus in a post-COVID world, there's a lot of talk about a green recovery. The challenge, though, is that in many of those conversations, green is interpreted as low carbon. And so we need to make sure that in the economic discourse around what green recovery looks like, that green is understood to actually mean green, right? So it needs to be both carbon neutral and nature positive. And we've shown there's a strong economic case and a wide array of effective measures of what we can do to invest in nature to accomplish economic stimulus and infrastructure development needs. So thank you. Back to you, Deborah.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I think you make a very compelling case for the economics of investing in nature in terms of its role in economic growth and job creation. And now we've talked about the importance of good government policy. We've talked about the economics. Kathy, you are one of the leading innovators in this field and had some very practical input and impact in terms of what you've been doing. Clearly, the risk arising from nature's loss or not accurately valuing nature is significant, which is becoming more and more frequent. Severe wildfires, heat waves, for example. In the past 40 years in the US, there were 300 climate-related disasters that exceeded 1 billion in losses, which is about 7 to 8 a year on average. But just in 2020, there were 22. Given how much our economies depend on nature, what do you see as the major risk touch points, and how are hedging or mitigation efforts taking shape in a practical way?
Thank you very much, Deborah, for inviting me today, and to my esteemed panelists. Wonderful to meet and see you all. So gosh, this is stimulating and frustrating, and we know what to do and we can see it so clearly. And the report that Andrew was the lead author for, you just laid it out so beautifully. But why are we not there? Why can't we do it? Why? And to see the International Energy Agency come out last week with the projection of the largest emissions in 10 years, really stunning. And we have to do a reality check about what it is that we're facing in terms of what we can do and what the role of nature is in protecting us. And as Andrew said, 30%, it's possible, but where are the projects? And I think what Mr. Paulson said at the very top, that it's not that we don't have money, or maybe it was Simon, or maybe everybody said it, it's not a money problem. There's money sloshing around everywhere. That's not the problem. The problem is getting the money into the projects. But first, don't cut it down. Don't hurt it. Number one, conserve it. It's so much better not to cut it down and then think about having to replant it. And when we think about the financial mechanisms that you can build based on nature's ecosystem service and protective value, I'm going to put mitigation aside for just a minute. And I will quote a story that ran maybe yesterday in the Miami Herald, and it says, the Florida property insurance market is in trouble. Mounting carrier losses and rising premiums threaten the booming real estate market. Okay, gosh, why would that be? Why would the real estate market be threatened? It's because there is not risk-based pricing for insurance. And so I want to talk about insurance for a minute. And folks that have worked with me, Andrew included, know I just love insurance to solve problems. A lot of times people, their eyes roll back. I get it, but it is a very exciting tool and approach. And so it really does offer some lessons and some tools for us. And the parametric insurance policy over the reef in Quintana Roo, Mexico, Andrew referenced it. And for those who don't know, I'll just give a quick summary. And that is that the reef is protecting the tourism economy. And so all of the beneficiaries, the fishers, the tour providers, the hotels, the businesses, and the ecosystem itself are benefiting from the reef's health. And so it's providing immense protection. And you can, of course, measure that protection and the avoided loss from a storm in a category 3, given the value of the hotels and businesses on the shore. You can calculate, thanks to the great scientists at the Nature Conservancy, you can calculate what the avoided loss would be in a category 3 storm with the reef at a certain type of health. And so that allows you to build mechanisms around that economic value it's providing. And so in essence, when a storm of a certain size, wind speed, et cetera, comes, it triggers a payout to the trust fund that was built to help rebuild the reef and training local people to repair the reef, et cetera. So it offers a window into the way that we can use insurance, but at the Adrian Arsh Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council, we are really focused on extreme heat. And in cities, the way that heat is, it's killing more Americans than any other climate-driven hazard. And one of the best, most cost-effective solutions, this will not surprise anyone, nature and tree cover. And so we're looking at how you can use forecast-based triggers. So you want the money to come before the devastation comes. And so while the Dasgupta report is focused on biodiversity, we're in the chain looking at how biodiversity is helping people. And so what are the financial mechanisms when you combine long-term access to capital to invest in building out urban forests? And I'll just use urban forests. You can also change surfaces and that sort of thing, but let's focus on nature. But you have a combined payout of insurance premium for protecting people, but also for longer term investments in things that cool the city. And this can apply in a rural setting also, but for the sake of, we're focused on reaching 1 billion people with resilient solutions by 2030. So really focused on where people are. And so I want to also go back to the idea of where the projects are. And I think two things. We've become accustomed to a certain percentage of return in our retirement funds. Whatever that number is, 12, 10, whatever that is, in that number, we know that nature is being harmed. And so if we have risk-based pricing, and I'm making some leaps here and we could unpack this, we won't have that kind of return. We can't have that kind of return. If we're hurting nature in that return, it's not sustainable. We know that, we're experiencing it. And so getting used to returns that reflect sustainable earnings and returns where we need to be. And we need to get comfortable with that number. And we won't see what we need to see if we can't say, okay, I'm comfortable at 6 because I know that's sustainable. And I know that in that 6, we don't have harm to nature, harm to people, et cetera, that's currently taking place, those externalities that are not currently calculated in the value. But back to the projects themselves, how do we get to the standard? And yes, absolutely need government intervention, but we also need for multi-stakeholder processes. That's how the projects get done. And that is slow and frustrating, but essential. And I think we just need to reframe on how we're going to get things done. And if you bring everybody along in a community, because if you look at a lot of the impact investment schemes, NatureVest is the one I know the best, a lot of projects are fantastic until they get to the community, and the community isn't fully bought in, quite ready for the metrics and the measuring or whatever those steps are that mean that the investor gets paid back. It fails. So all of that effort, and that means that we need to spend more time in multi-stakeholder processes. And I think all of us could say we've been in them and we know that they're slow, but I think they're essential. And we need to say that's just how things get done. If we want that project pipeline to grow, we're going to have to get comfortable with that. And then prior to coming to the Atlantic Council, I was at Bank of America, and I was vice president for Senior Vice President for Social and Environmental Risk, and wrote the first TCFD report for the bank. And thinking about the TCFD and the TNFD, that's fantastic parallels. There's a lot happening inside a financial institution, and I think you all know that really well, that mean the comfort level with disclosing risk. And I think there's some real work that we could do in helping institutions get comfortable with understanding what they're disclosing, and then what to do about what they're disclosing. And I mean in the terms of nature at this point, not climate necessarily. And so I think that's my thing for right now. Let's get into the conversation. But there's so much promise, and then the reality of what we're facing. And I think we need a shock to the system. I think we need to say we can't do what we're doing, and we need to all say this is wholly unsustainable. So Deborah, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Kathy. And I think it's reassuring to know that there are actually some existing tools within kind of our toolkit that can be applied if you think of this creatively. And it reminds me, Sonia, when we first started working together about 5 years ago on the green finance issues, and with Simon, still in many of the large financial institutions, looking at green finance and sustainability really were viewed as philanthropic activities. And you have been a driver to take it from philanthropy to the mainstream, and helping create that regulatory structure. And the work that you're doing at the IIF has really been transformational. I know Simon and his team have been big contributors to that. Do you see some of those similar trends happening around nature? Do you see that the financial institutions are starting to think creatively about how to create financial tools or innovative financial products that can attract private sector capital to go into the very kinds of projects that we're talking about today? Kind of what are some of the obstacles to that, and what do you see as some of the opportunities?
Thank you, Deborah and Simon, Andrew, Kathy. Those remarks were really helpful and scene setting. I mean, not to sound too much like a Disney children's movie, but I think you're right, Deborah. It's a whole new world. It really is entirely. We're delighted to be with you here today and appreciate the chance to share some views from across our global membership. And I wanted just to highlight here that the IIF has quite a unique perspective on natural capital, given the breadth of our membership. We've got about 450 members across 75 countries, and about half of those are in developing and emerging economies. So I just want that to color what I'm going to say here. And to illustrate, I wanted to mention two of our work streams, ongoing work streams that address natural capital financing in the context of sustainable finance. First of all, our sovereign debt policy workstream, which is focused on stable capital flows, sound debt management, and fair debt restructuring. And in this context, we're hearing increasing interest from our members on the creditor side in natural capital solutions. And Simon, we've had some good discussions on these issues. In debt workouts and restructuring, so green debt relief, as the IMF managing director mentioned during the spring meetings, big focus on that. But also in integrating natural capital considerations into fixed income markets more broadly and supporting inclusive recovery. So that's one sort of trend observing. Also in our sovereign debt policy work streams, we work closely with a wide range of sovereign borrowers from emerging and developing economies, notably in support of things like good faith negotiations, sound investor relations, debtor-creditor dialogue, and all of that. So increasingly, it's clear that attention to natural capital and natural capital preservation is becoming part and parcel of a sound policy framework for many of these economies. So I think we will obviously continue to champion that cause. And finally, I'd highlight the work of the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. This is a private sector-led initiative working to scale an effective and efficient voluntary carbon market to help meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So like the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, which is also private sector-led, this is a private sector-led initiative set up by Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action, chaired by Bill Winters of Standard Chartered, and we at the IIF are project sponsors. I want to stress here that scaling up voluntary carbon markets, in addition to the kind of core objective to being able to price and trade carbon credits, helping companies meet their carbon neutral and net zero targets, also helps support new climate and environmental technologies and bring down cost curves. And this will help bring these technologies to market earlier and decrease what Bill Gates refers to as a green premium against carbon intensive alternatives. And importantly, a very significant share of these potential carbon offset projects are located in the global south. So carbon credits can help generate flows of private capital to these economies. And in addition to pure sort of climate mitigation issues, carbon offset projects also generate much broader environmental, social, and economic benefits, ranging from increased biodiversity, job creation, support for local communities, and so on. More broadly, just taking a step back, it's clear that biodiversity and ecosystem services are evidently important for financial firms, given the interdependence between ecosystems in the economy and society at large. And as Simon, you were saying, these biodiversity and ecosystem services underpin over half of global GDP. And the three largest sectors, construction, agriculture, food, generate something like $8 trillion in gross added value. So if you ask why the global financial sector should care about pricing nature, I think that gives a pretty good idea of why. And Kathy, you had mentioned the investment risks associated with biodiversity, and given estimates that a fifth of all countries face potential ecosystem collapse, is clearly wide-ranging nature-related financial risks, asset depreciation, lost investment opportunities. And I think for the financial sector, one thing that is a significant source of worry is that countries and companies could face higher costs or constrained access to financing given these risks, and particularly given our limited ability at present to price them. I think there's a clear role for the private financial sector in raising awareness of nature-related risks and opportunities, so contributing to the development of what you could refer to as nature-centric finance. And given the spotlight that the pandemic has put on biodiversity, this is a tremendous opportunity to scale up natural capital and biodiversity finance. And it is, at the end of the day, the business of the financial sector to mobilize capital to take advantage of these opportunities. I thought, Andrew, your remarks on infrastructure were really very, very interesting. So the opportunities we're speaking about clearly include financing for smart, green, and sustainable infrastructure. I bet it's been impressive over the past several years to see the remarkable change in the conversation around infrastructure finance and the shift away from financing fossil fuel infrastructure. And this is worldwide, here in the US, obviously, across Europe, and notably so in Asia, with great momentum in Asia. If you look at the work of the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Green Belt and Road Initiative, and a whole range of national development finance institutions like the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, which also made a significant announcement last year about a shift away from financing coal. So you can clearly see this change in focus toward financing infrastructure that supports renewables and new green technologies and natural capital more broadly. So, as a number of speakers have highlighted, this is kind of a make or break year, given the huge focus. You've got the G20, you've got the G7, you have the international standard setters in financial regulation, you have COP biodiversity, you have COP more generally, and having the US sort of back at the table here, it's an unprecedented bringing together. The stars are in alignment, you might say. And in this context, I'd also underscore, the remarks that I think both Simon and Kathy made about the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. This is a major initiative that's going to help address a key problem we see across the spectrum in sustainable finance: lack of global standards. Without global standards, and this applies to climate finance, but also to natural capital finance, perhaps more so. And when you speak with financial firms, I think there's a great deal of concern about how, I think Hank mentioned earlier the need to understand and disclose risks associated with natural capital. And I think there's a clear understanding of that imperative, but also a lot of concern about how on earth we're going to do that. I mean, I think the sense would be, if you speak to people who are involved in writing these TCFD reports and future TNFD reports, they're going to be like, we barely understand climate risk, let alone natural capital risk. But in the same way that the understanding, the data, the toolkit, the metrics, how that this has all evolved very quickly for climate, I think it may be even more so for natural capital, given the experience that's been built up in understanding climate-related risks. So, you know, at the end of the day, we have to get to a much better understanding of climate as a material financial risk, and that TNFD is going to be equally important as the TCFD was, if not more so. I'd also highlight, it's quite interesting in the recent request for input by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, there was a clear question about to what extent the SEC should be looking at beyond climate risks, including areas like biodiversity and natural capital, which is an interesting component of that request for input. We need, you know, and I think, Kathy, you made this point, to reframe how things get done. And in this context, you know, we clearly, there's very strong support for the G20 and the Financial Stability Board in their road mapping and charting course toward effective global standards, because without that, you know, we're sort of lost. So, you know, to sum up, you know, biodiversity and natural capital risk clearly have financially material consequences, as we've been discussing. And the private financial sector is rapidly moving up the learning curve in terms of understanding the urgency of addressing these risks. There's a lot of work to be done. I wouldn't underestimate the challenges ahead, but, you know, I think it's often been said, nature can't wait. We can't wait for all the world's climate issues to be resolved before tackling natural capital issues head on. So I'll stop there, Deborah.
Great. Thank you, Sonia. I think that really was very informative. And we've been so fortunate to really, I think, delve into what are some of the key issues. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is the first in what we hope will be a series of webinars to start to really dig into some of these nature-based solutions, look at some of the opportunities, look at some of the challenges, explore some of the innovative means, and really try and help change the framework of thinking of financing nature not as a philanthropic activity, again, as we saw in the context of green finance in the early years, but really the importance of mainstreaming it, both as investment opportunities, but how essential it can be, as we heard through the New York City example, to some of our basic needs, like the provision of water, like debt for equity swaps, and addressing the debt crisis that's happening around the world. Unfortunately, we are very close to the end of our time. So what we're going to do, because we do have some really excellent comments and questions, is that Kristen Gomez, who is our Paulson Institute colleague, is going to post her email. And I suggest if you have questions, email them to us. We will get them to the appropriate people and provide you with answers in writing, if that works. And we thank you so much for joining us. I really thank all our panelists and partners in this, not only in today's exchange, but really in this battle, if we could call it that, to raise awareness and take on the importance of protecting our natural resources. Thanks to our wonderful panel, and many thanks to all of you for watching. Bye.
A lot.
Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you.